I say we get going. I'll start. Hey everyone, my name, for those of you who don't know, is TJ Von Osen. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the coordinator of the Philadelphia Reentry Coalition. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also some new people. Just wanting to say that I'm always available to talk more about the Reentry Coalition if this is your first time here or in a Reentry Coalition space. There's very little required of people to become members of the coalition. It's really about who is interested in, excited about this work and connecting to other people. And I would love to follow up with any of you. So I'll be sure to share my contact information and all of that. But to the point of today, really excited for this training. We're joined by Randall A, the legislative director for PARSOL, that's Pennsylvania Association for Rational Sex Offense Laws. They are really championing a lot of the advocacy in this space when it comes to supporting people who are on the registry or who have any sort of sex offense on their record. Randall and I are working on the Pennsylvania Reentry Council subcommittee for supporting people who are on sex offenses, and he was gracious enough to spend some time preparing the information that will be shared today. And I'm really excited to learn from Randall as well, and I'll be sure to share any materials he shares with us after the call. Wanting to just say that I am recording this training, and I understand that this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, and I want this to be a space where we can speak candidly and ask questions from a place of curiosity and maybe not complete knowledge. So I'll be turning off this recording when we reach the end so that we can have question and answer, and anyone can make any comments they feel. And I understand that there are also maybe some people with lived experience on the registry on this call, so wanting to make room at the end of the training for people to share about their experiences as well if they feel so moved. So I'll definitely be stopping the recording then, and so we'll wait to answer any questions until the end as well. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Randall, and thank you again, Randall, for being here.
Well, my pleasure, TJ. Thank you, and thanks everyone who showed up, who took the time out of your day to join us. And you mentioned coming from a place of incomplete knowledge, and that resonates with me, of course, because I'm still learning and growing in this space, and do the best I can. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to share this information here. I'm hoping I'm able to speak clearly today. I'm adjusting to Invisalign, and so I've got these aligners on my teeth, and I'm hoping it doesn't affect my speech that much. So again, thanks for joining us. Our topic today will be supporting people on the Sex Offense Registry, people with sex offenses in general. And I'd like to talk a little bit about our organization, PARSOL. As TJ mentioned, we are the Pennsylvania Association for Rational Sexual Offense Laws. We are a volunteer group formed in 2017. And initially, our main focus was the injustices of the registry and the difficulties of the registry. But we quickly found out that we weren't paying enough attention to, I guess, all sides or all dimensions of this issue. And so we really pivoted a lot now, where we talk a lot more about prevention, and this goes hand in hand with a better registry, a more effective registry. But I make it my business to connect with policymakers in the Capitol. As you can see, we had a table set up, representative senators, to do my best to educate on what is effective, what is working as far as prevention of sexual abuse and sexual violence, and what's not, the utility of the registry, the unique challenges that this population faces, and that's what I do. So talked a little bit about the legislative committee, but we also have an education committee which develops materials, brochures, fact cards. We're working on videos to address these kind of issues, to start this conversation, because this is an issue that we need to talk about more. We can't ignore it any longer. The problem's not going away. And we have a legal committee, and that tracks the legal cases that are moving through the Pennsylvania courts, all the way up to the highest court, the Supreme Court, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. We have resources available on our website for people who are on the registry or who are curious about the registry or who want to know more about the law. And finally, we offer support system to people who have been affected by the registry and who want to get involved. To be clear, we do not condone any form of non-consensual sex. These are serious crimes, and people who commit them should be prosecuted and punished appropriately. The quote there you'll see is from some of our materials. The punishment for a lot of people who come into contact with criminal justice system continues after their release and after they've served their sentence, and that goes for all classes of people who have a background as far as discrimination, but people with sex offenses are subject to unique ones, and I'm sure a lot of you people who work with this population are familiar with those unique challenges. We don't have a lawyer on our team, so we don't give legal advice, but that's something we're working on, partnering up with a lawyer. So here's our goal for today and our plan of action. This is what I'd like to cover, and we're going to keep it under 1 hour. And as TJ mentioned, we will have some time for questions at the end. So I'd like to briefly touch on the state of affairs, if you will, for people on the Sex Offense Registry in Pennsylvania and people with sex offenses in general in the United States. This is Dr. Eric Janis, and he gave an excellent presentation which informed me a lot. And he talked about the creation of a second-class citizen. And he explains that in the United States, we have more or less accepted that there's a class of people who do not deserve the full protection of the law. I'm sure you all know, you've probably heard it day to day, that people with sex offenses is really the last category of people where it's openly all right to condone violence against them. For many other protected classes in our nation, we've at least made that kind of progress where it's not acceptable to condone violence against a group of people just based on their background. But that's really not the case with people with sex offenses. You can get away with saying things like we should castrate them all, we should kill them all, we should lock them up forever. And so even if we are willing to write off a certain amount of people that do not deserve the full protection of the law, we're doing ourselves a disservice because we are missing out on the opportunities to implement prevention methods and to make our policies more effective at preventing these kind of crimes before they ever happen. Now, of course, it's my position that we should not write off a category of people based on their history, and we should see them as full people and work with them as best as we can to keep the community safe, of course, and improve their own lives. So again, most of you work with people coming out of prison who are trying to reenter society. You're familiar with the unique challenges that people with this background face. And I appreciate the work that you're doing to help them get back on their feet, to reintegrate. And it's conversations like the one we're having and the work that you all do that does make a difference in this regard. So some history, don't want to get too deep into this, but it's a twisted and winding road that Pennsylvania's Sex Offense Registry has come down. And it started in 1996 with the first Megan's Law. A court challenge brought that down, and it was rewritten and reinstated in 2000. A court challenge brought that one down, and it was rewritten and reinstated in 2005. And the court challenge brought that one down, and so on down the line. And that brings us to February 2018, where we have the latest, most securely packed and fixed law around the Sex Offense Registry, and that is known as the Sex Offense Registration and Notification Act 2. And this is modeled off of federal legislation that was signed in 2006, and that the federal government strongly urges Pennsylvania and all states and territories to get in line with. They give a set of guidelines and they say, this is how you should make your registry. If you don't, we're going to deny you a small amount of money, but we strongly urge you to do that. So I guess the real takeaway from here is that these laws are constitutionally questionable, as you can see from it being rewritten 5 times, and we're getting in gear for a 6th time. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Again, if you're interested in the fine details of what brought these laws down, what the cases were, who the plaintiffs and the defendants were, you can check out our website, and I wrote the history of that. So some important Supreme Court cases, again, don't want to spend too much time on it, but the first one there in 2014 established that juveniles shall not be listed on Pennsylvania's registry. This is not the case in other parts of the nation. In other territories, there are children who are on the registry. I've heard stories as young as 9. I've never seen that myself, but there are people who are under 18 listed on registries for the public's, awareness. That is not the case in Pennsylvania as of 2016 or 2014, and then 2016 affirmed it. Eunice was decided in 2017, and this brought some major changes to Pennsylvania's sex offender registry. It declared that the law that was passed in 2012 was punitive, that the requirements of registration and the travel needed to perform the registration and all the details provided in registration were so intrusive that it qualified as punishment. And so they ruled that people who were convicted before this law was passed cannot be subjected to an ex post facto punishment that violates the Pennsylvania and the US Constitution. You can't apply a punishment to somebody who has committed the crime before the law was passed. And so that resulted in now 2 tiers of laws for people with sex offenses, and we'll talk about that in a few more slides. The last and most relevant case is Commonwealth versus Torsilleri, and this is going through the courts right now. Myself and other PARSOL members attended the Supreme Court hearing in November of 2019, and it was decided in June. The cases, the issues that were brought up by Torsilleri focus on the right to reputation, which is unique in the Pennsylvania Constitution. We have a guaranteed right to reputation. No other constitution explicitly protects the right to reputation as Pennsylvania does. It's right in there in the text, the right to reputation. And so Torsilleri argued that his right to reputation was being infringed by this irrebuttable presumption. This irrebuttable presumption that all people on the sex offense registry were at a high risk of reoffending. And so in June 2020, the Supreme Court kicked the can back down the road, so to speak. They sent the case back to the trial court, and they said, we're not going to decide this until you, the Commonwealth, answers a question. You need to prove that that the legislative findings, and I'll quote, that, quote, sexual offenders pose a high risk of committing additional sex offenses, and protection of the public from this type of offender is a paramount governmental interest. Well, the court said that the state needs to prove that. Pennsylvania needs to prove that all people with sex offenses listed on this registry are at a high rate of reoffending. The defendant, Torsilleri, provided evidence that they are not at a high rate of offending, and the court wanted to give the Commonwealth a chance to make their case and fully make it. So that's where it stands now. It's been sent back to the trial court, and it's going to work its way through the process again. And that's in the Chester City trial court. I want to say it's at the county level right now. Last thing I'll talk about with Torsilleri is this quote here. Just again highlights this idea that you can't paint everyone with such a broad brush. And we have seen defendants in the recent months be granted relief from the registry on the argument of this irrebuttable presumption. You cannot assume that people with convictions such as those listed here, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, or other non-sexual crimes like interference with custody of children, you can't prove that these people are at a high risk of sexually reoffending. So that's what we're looking at. And again, we'll probably see a rewriting of Pennsylvania's SORNA once again after this case is decided, perhaps this year, perhaps next year. So our topic today is supporting those in the registry, and here's my general outline and my suggestions as far as how we can support people on the registry. And again, thanks to you all who work with this population for your public service. I'm not a clinician. I have a degree in psychology, but who doesn't, from Penn State? Uh, uh, but I'm not a clinician. Obviously, I'm not a parole or probation officer. I have limitations in that regard. However, I myself have been through the system. I got out in 2014. I have a sexual offense. I've been on the list since 2014. And I can speak to my 11 years in therapy, my time through institutions, and the research that I've done for PARSOL and for my own edification. So my goals here again is to provide you all some resources and some ideas, for talking about this issue, and resources and other ideas you can bring to clients you work with or the populations that you work with. If there's people in your life, some those of you who do not work with this field, if there's some people in your life who have this background, perhaps you'll share some of these resources with them. And also just to have this conversation, because it's one that I'm not sure that we have enough. This is something we don't really talk about, and a goal of mine is to promote this kind of dialogue, to recognize that there are these people in our community, and that they need help as well, and they deserve the same kind of treatment that any other person would. So as far as support, before we get into these three areas I wanted to mention, I wanted to talk about the therapeutic relationship. You'll see here a quote from American Psychological Association study, and the take-home message was that the therapeutic relationship is extremely important. And for those of you who are in the mental health field, I assume that you're familiar with this, building a rapport. But I feel that this can be translated and applied to those who are who work with legal supervision, parole and probation, and federal supervision, and those who are doing employment counseling. Any of you who are doing reentry services, the therapeutic relationship or just the regular relationship is very important. And so when I think about developing a good relationship and trust, I think about what makes a good friend. I think what makes a good friend is somebody you can relate with. It's somebody who you feel easy talking to. It's somebody who you don't mind being around. I think you show each other mutual respect. And so I think it's important to keep this in mind when you're working with a client, or even if you're not working with a client, if you're just working, if you have somebody in your life who has this background. And this goes to people without this background too. Kindness is very important, and I think you get a lot farther when you make an effort to understand people and listen. And so listening is very important. I would also be careful with your language. You'll notice that I have not used the word sex offender yet. I don't utilize that term because it makes a lot of assumptions. I've been called a sex offender by people who work on my reentry and who work with supervision. And it's kind of common language. That's what you call us, right? But it really does imply that you're less than, you're a problem, you're at risk, you're a risk, and that you are committing crimes. And so I have a sex offense, but I'm not a sex offender. I haven't offended since my arrest. I've lived crime-free in my community since my arrest, so I don't identify as a sex offender. And so watch your language. I would suggest that when you're working with this population. So the first prong in our three-pronged approach for supporting people with sex offenses is know the law. And as I referenced earlier, nowadays we have two sets of laws for people on the Sex Offense Registry in Pennsylvania. We have subchapter H, which applies to all the people whose crimes were committed after December 20th, 2012. And we have subchapter I for all those people who committed their crimes before that date. And this date is when the most recent enactment of SORNA, the Sex Offense Registration Notification Act, was passed in Pennsylvania. And so again, the court ruled that you cannot give this punishment to people who committed their crimes before the law was passed. So there are differences, pretty significant differences between the two, a lot of similarities, but you'll see some here. Subchapter H is again for people who committed their crimes after December 2012, and it's modeled after federal legislation. It was Pennsylvania's attempt to get in line and become compliant with the federal requirements or suggestions of the federal SORNA. It's more punitive because it requires more effort from the offender. It is more intrusive and more invasive, and it requires a lot more information. There are longer periods on the registry. And again, the court did rule that all of these requirements were punitive. Now, they can stand because presumably somebody who commits a crime should be aware of the law and the consequences of the law. And so these can stand. Nonetheless, the justices were clear in saying it is punitive, this registry. In contrast, subchapter I, it's a lot more lenient, if you will. It's less onerous. It requires less of the person on the registry. They're afforded more privacy, and in general, they get off the registry in a shorter amount of time. So here are some of the elements that need to be reported, and this is an exhaustive list for the things that need to be reported when somebody on the registry changes any one of these things within 72 hours. People in subchapter H, again, if you committed your crime after 2012, you must report in person to a registration site to update these following items. And by contrast, subchapter I, very few things need to be updated and reported. And in fact, you can update by mail if you get a form from the Pennsylvania State Police. And as you can see, it's a lot easier. Now, some people I've spoken to, they choose to err on the side of caution, and they update everything. And even if they are subject to subchapter I, they still report their new phone numbers, they report their email addresses, they report their vehicle information. And I can understand that they choose to be safe instead of be sorry. And it is high consequences if you're found out of regulation. If you're found to be violation of the state regulation requirements, registration requirements, it's a felony. And so I can understand that stance. But to some of your clients or the people in your life who might value liberty and who might want to keep as much of their privacy as they choose to, this is the statute. Again, the source you'll see on the bottom there, that's taken right out of the text of the law from the consolidated statutes. Finally, there are also differences in the amounts of time that you need to be on the registry. Briefly, subchapter I, you're either on for 10 years or you're on for life, depending on your crime. Subchapter H, we've got a tier system, tier 1, 2, and 3, and that's 15 years, 25 years, or lifetime. Knowing the law, a common question that people struggle with who are on this registry is, what do I do about travel, and how do I travel, and is that even possible for me? And it's a tough issue. Obviously, parole, probation, federal supervision, they've got their requirements. Pennsylvania state has their own requirements, as well as the other 49 states and all the other territories that a person might want to go and visit. Puerto Rico's got their own requirements. There's the federal law requirements that the federal government needs you to report. If you do go international, there is a marked passport that you must obtain that lists that you have committed a sexual offense against a minor and that you were subject to United States Code 22, yada, yada, yada. And then there's international policies. If a person does want to travel internationally, those nations may choose or not to allow you into their nation based on based on your background. And so obviously there's a lot to consider here, and it's no wonder that it's very difficult to get a solid answer as to can I travel or not, and how. So I hope to clear a little bit of that up. As far as subchapter H goes, for people whose offenses were committed after 2012, they need to report to the Pennsylvania authorities if they're going to be out of town for 7 or more days. And that means if they're going to be out of their city, even within the state, they need to report if you're going to be gone for more than 7 days. And it certainly means that if you plan to travel interstate, and then you also need to report when you get back to your home after 7 days. If you don't go for 7 days, no need to report. But that might not be the case with the state that you're going to. So you're going to need to check the laws in New Jersey or Montana or wherever it is that you're traveling to. And NARSOL, the National Association for Rational Sexual Offense Laws, has a great matrix, has a great state-by-state listing of what these states' laws are and policies, and what you need to do if you're considering visiting that state. As far as international travel, Pennsylvania law requires that you report the details of your trip 21 days in advance. For subchapter I, starkly different. There is no travel requirement for subchapter I. This was surprising to me, but again, it comes right out of the statute. I just looked it up yesterday, and there are no requirements if you're going to be away for 7 or more days. However, international travel, it's a different story because the federal government requires notification 21 days in advance. This quote here is from the U.S. Marshal's website. As far as your chance of getting into another nation, that's a whole other ball of wax. And even if you do get a phone call that says, yes, we've looked at your record and you will be admitted, you really don't know until you're at the gate and the customs officer decides to let you in or not. And I imagine this applies to a lot of people with criminal backgrounds, but in particular those with sex offenses. So this is a great example of how complex some of these laws can be surrounding sex offenses. Again, there's a lot of different players at stake, from the local governments to the state governments, city governments. But as far as I'm concerned, the statute is the gold standard. If you have any doubt, if you want to provide some certainty to the people you're working with, have them check the statute. And it's not easy reading legalese, but get in contact with us and we'll be happy to send you the statute and do some explaining. You can feel free to contact us. So our next prong here is knowing the research, and I'd like to share some statistics and demographics with you. Our most recent data from 2020, according to the Pennsylvania State Police, which maintains the Sex Offense Registry, there's 21,611 people listed in the registry nowadays. Most of them are on the less restrictive, easier subchapter I, 65%, but about a third are subchapter H. As far as racial breakdowns, I found some information from 2014, and the vast majority of people on the registry are white, about 75%, but about 25% are Black. And this stands in contrast to the state population that is Black. And this is an approximation using 2010 census data, but the approximation for 2013 is around 11.5%. 2020 data gives it at around 12.5%. So we can assume the Black population around the time of this research was right around 11.5, 12%. So the findings of this study, which you can find reference on the bottom there, is that certain groups of people have a disproportionate likelihood of being listed on a public sex offense registry. It suggests that race certainly plays a factor in deciding who gets on the registry and who does not. And beyond that, the authors were not willing to make any suggestions or any conclusions. They did say they highly doubt that Black people commit more sex offenses than white people. And of course, the old psychological research line, more research is needed. But that's real. We find the sex offense registry, like a lot of other crimes and prosecutions and arrests, seems to favor Black people more than white people. Now, these are state demographics. As far as nationwide, we are approaching around 1 million people on sex offense registries throughout all 50 states and all the territories. We're approaching 1 million, the last I looked. And I think this highlights the utility of this tool. If there are so many people listed on this registry, how are we to know who is truly a danger? How are we to know who is truly at a high risk? Consider that we have people, I was just looking at this recently, born in the 20s, and they're listed on sex offense registries. Now, I'm not sure if there's still a high risk to the community. You know, you're pushing 100, and do you really need to be on this list anymore? And that's just one example. This goes to the practice of using your offense as a category for whether or not you should be listed and how. Not so much, or instead of gauging your level of risk, it gauges your offense, not your level of risk. So there's some room for improvement there. Research on recidivism. When we talk about recidivism, of course, we talk about committing another crime and returning to the system, returning to prison, going through this revolving door. And of course, we need to tease apart the differences between crimes. If we're talking about people with sex offenses, committing any crime, then the level of recidivism is about average, and it's not low. You know, it's about 50% of people who return to the system for drug offenses, technical violations, registration violations. You know, forgive me for saying half. I really just kind of made that one up, but I know it's higher than the level of people who commit sexual offenses. What I mean to say is that people with sex offenses who recidivate sexually have a very low rate. And I have some research on the next slide to report that. It's important to consider, however, that reporting is questionable. A lot of sex offenses never get reported. You know, these are shameful and hurtful and secretive things that occur. And it's, of course, not a guarantee that all crimes are going to be reported. Now, I think it's also important to state that a lot of crimes don't get reported, sexual or not. But the best research that we have does point to the following trends: that primarily sex offenses are committed by first-time offenders. And anecdotally, you can think about the stories that you might see in the newspaper about a coach or a parent or a neighbor. And typically it's not somebody who's on the sex offense registry who has committed this act that you're reading about, who has molested a child. Typically it's a person who has a relationship to the victim. And that can be a parent, it can be a family member, it can be a friend of the family, it can be a coach, it can be a priest. And as far as adults, victims, it can be a boyfriend, it can be a husband, it can be a friend, it can be, you know, somebody in a college dorm. So we have a trend of people who have a relationship to the victim and who in general are first-time offenders. The research that we have does point to single digits being the range for recidivism as far as sexual recidivism. And I would point to a lot of the evidence that the torcillary lawyers brought to the Supreme Court. Again, we talked about that. Some studies that I wanted to share with you are from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, 3.1 in 2008. That's from a 2013 study. And the United States Department of Justice shows 7.7% after 9 years. And so I wish I had some more data to show you, but you know, by nature, these studies take a long time to compile because you're tracking people over a number of years. And so this was the most recent that I could find. Reporting data, as I alluded to earlier, it might not always be reported. And when it is reported, we're having a hard time collecting it. I understand that the Pennsylvania Reentry Council, we're working on our stats and our data collection. And it's not as good as it could be, but we want to do our best to compile more information on recidivism. But this is the best data we have. We can only go with what we have, and this is what we got. Moving along for recidivism, this is a graph that came out of Hansen's research, and it shows desistance levels. So people with this history were gauged and given a static 99R score. Level 1 would be considered low risk. Level 4B would be considered a high risk, so like somebody who committed a rape or had a history of repeated sexual offenses. Level 1 might be somebody with an internet offense, child pornography. And what it found was after time, people become about as much likely to offend as your person off the street who does not have a history of sex offenses would be likely to offend. And for those level 1 offenders, it's pretty much the time that they're released from prison. Their level of reoffense or of sexual offense is about the same as John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public. And even those who are considered the most high risk after 21 years eventually get to a point where their risk level is very low. Pedophilia. So not everyone on the Sex Offense Registry obviously has pedophilia, and those of you who work with people on the registry can attest to this. Many do, however. And so it's important to have an understanding and have, I guess, an open-mindedness in a way to those of us who, those people you work with or those people in your life who do struggle with these feelings or who do harbor these feelings. And it's important to give them the space to be able to talk about it and to provide them with the resources where they can deal with this issue that they're having and this burden that they carry. So pedophilia is defined by attraction to pubescent or prepubescent children. Now, this does not include teenagers because, to a degree, attraction to a person who's 16 or 17 who is developed would more or less be considered normal. Of course, it wouldn't be considered legal, but it would be considered normal for an adult male to be attracted to a 16 or 17-year-old of the type of people they're attracted to. So that's why we define it as prepubescent or pubescent children. So how many people have pedophilia? It's hard to say. Not many people are willing to admit that, yes, I'm attracted to children. I'm primarily attracted to children. And so we have a problem with self-reporting and a struggle there. The idea that some people hold is that because you yourself were victimized, now you are more likely to offend others. Victims of child abuse become abusers. But what some of the research, points to or asks is, if so many women are victims of childhood sexual abuse, and they are, why don't more women offend? And they don't. It's very rare. And so James Cantor out of Canada sought to answer some of these questions. And he did MRI studies with people who identified as having pedophilia. And some of the conclusions from his research is that there's an inescapable biological influence, and he would point to a natal influence, something in the developing brain when you're in the womb. And he would say absolutely that you were born this way. You were born with a predisposition to being attracted to children. He points to these brain differences and the brain scans. He showed sexual stimuli to adults and identified what lights up in their brain. And he showed images of children to people who identified as having an attraction to children. And it was the same area that lit up. And so what he pointed to was that it's the same wiring. It's just that the people who had pedophilia had a cross wiring. It was normal attraction was somehow rewired to inappropriate attraction, in this case, children. And we cannot change the structure of the brain, but of course we can address behavior. And so that's what Dr. Cantor would promote, and that's what he's working on. He advocates for more research. He points out that brain scans are a lot cheaper than prison, and wants to make a greater effort to better understanding this problem. And if we can somehow address it while it's happening natally, while the brain is developing, well, then wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if we could do that? So how does this information help you support someone on the registry? Well, it may or may not. Again, not everyone has attraction to children, and not everyone's going to be willing to talk about it with you. But I think that if you can recognize that if it's somebody who is struggling with these feelings, that it's something they're born with, and it's not a choice of theirs, that I think that kind of empathy can be helpful. And again, this isn't going to apply to everybody, but for some people it will. And that can make a big difference for somebody who feels like they have an awful secret who they can't tell anybody or else. So as we wind down, I wanted to talk about resources, and the tough ones is when I'm basketing the stuff that you all work on all the time. Those of you who are reentry, talking about housing and I'm talking about employment. These are the biggest challenges for people coming into prison, and in particular those with sex offenses who are even less likely to get a second chance and to get a fair shake at renting an apartment or working at a job that they are qualified for. And so I don't have a whole lot to add to employment resources and housing resources. I can talk a little bit about Harrisburg, that's where I'm located. But PARSOL, we're doing our best to compile a city-by-city resource guide for housing that has proven to accept people with this kind of background. One piece of advice I would give for this particular struggle in housing and employment is urge the person with the history to make it personal. And what I mean by that is that it's not enough to go to the interview, shake their hand and say, I look forward to hearing back from you, knowing that you're going to have a background check. Or it's not enough to go see an apartment, shake their hand and say, it's a lovely place, I'd love to move in. You need to follow up. And this is what I did. I wrote a handwritten letter to the landlord, and I explained to him what happened, where I've been, what happened, who I am now, what I'm into now, what I'm working on now. And I laid it all out for him. And so it worked. It was the first apartment I looked at, and I'm very happy with it. And the letter worked. And so I'm not sure this is a strategy that a lot of people are aware of or willing to use. And not everyone has the resources to do that. Not everyone can write that letter. But I feel like making it personal is going to increase chances of success a lot more. As far as enrichment goes, we want to promote pro-social activity, right? And we don't know what we don't know. And so education is important because, I point to my experience in my prison time as the best thing that ever happened to me, because I learned so much and I was able to work on myself. And so the education that you're doing as treatment providers is very important, and it is expanding horizons of people with this population. Cognitive distortions, that's something we talked a lot about while I was in prison, and that I learned a lot about the way I think, and that made a difference to me. As far as replacement goes, replacement of old behaviors, it's tough because new behaviors, pro-social ones, aren't always as exciting or thrilling or as fun or as stimulating as old ones are. If you talk to somebody who's struggling with pornography and has viewed pornography for their entire lives, and now you tell them you can't do it, go play the violin, well, it's really not the same. You don't get the same kind of rush, you don't get the same kind of feelings from that. So it's difficult to replace behavior, but sometimes even just recognizing that helps. That I understand that what you used to do did something for you, or it scratched an itch for you, or that you were hurting at the time, and just even recognizing that can be helpful. Investment is what did it for me, and I found that to be effective. When I got out of prison, I got connected with the Capital Region Ex-Offender Support Coalition, and I had some people who invited me to attend meetings and to get involved, and I would sign out of the halfway house and go to these meetings. And it was wonderful, and I met people and I networked, and I felt even just a little bit that I mattered, that I had a seat at the table, that I was doing something. And that was such a great, important thing for me, because it gave me some dignity. And I would advise those of you who work with this population to encourage the people you work with to find something like this, to find something that gives them that kind of sense of dignity and involvement. So there are some suggestions here And not everyone's going to work for everyone. You know, some people don't want to do any of this. They want to watch DVDs and smoke cigarettes and stay at home. And you know, if that's what they're into, then that's their choice. But I wanted to provide some options for you. So NARSOL I put in bold because it has extensive resources for people who are on the registry as far as travel. It has its own social network. It's got frequently asked questions. It's got fact cards, support systems. If you don't know about NARSOL and you work with people on the Sex Offense Registry, if you take nothing else from this presentation, take NARSOL. It's a great resource. Of course, the reentry coalitions that you're working with, is there any room for this person to join? How can they help? Do you have any ideas where they might get involved, where they might start their own branch or contribute something? There's PARSOL, of course, which I work with. We are the main group in Pennsylvania focusing on this issue, and we're always looking for new volunteers. And it's given me, again, a sense of agency, a sense of purpose, and a real feeling of giving back after being dormant for so much of my life, after being checked out for so much of my life. It gives me something to do, and it gives me something to work towards. The Pennsylvania Prison Society, most of you are probably familiar with. This is a volunteer organization which aims to support people who are still serving sentences, and they do visits. I'm not sure if that's appropriate for the populations that you work with, visiting prisons, but hey, if it is, maybe a pen pal, consider passing that along. There's CADB, which is the Coalition for the Abolishment of Death by Incarceration, which is working to get our seniors home, people who have served decades and decades and decades and who really pose no more risk and who no longer need to be in prison. There's a group of people in Pennsylvania and around the country who are working to get seniors out of prison. And again, this is another way where somebody who is getting out can give back, and they can feel like they have been there, they've done that, and they can speak to these issues, and they can make a difference and do some good. The second column here is, I don't know, I guess you could say political and a little more of the activism bend. And again, that's not going to be for everybody, but hey, for some people it may be. We the People is a grassroots organization that's pushing for progressive change in Pennsylvania, and they're always looking for volunteers, and they have plenty of ways where you can get involved in your city and around the state and virtually. The New Pennsylvania Project is working to register more voters in Pennsylvania, just like they did with the New Georgia Project, and they had a lot of success there. Really brought a lot of people online and into the system who were not before. Pennsylvania Stands Up is another grassroots organization that's working on national reform and pro-democracy initiatives there. They're always looking for volunteers and people to get involved. Specialty interest groups, you name it, ask the person who you work with what they're into. Are they a hunter? Are they an artist? Are they a runner? Do they like movies? Are they a movie buff? Any one of these things, there are groups in Pennsylvania, and certainly in a city like Philadelphia, where people are into this stuff, and they're meeting up, and they're pushing, and they're growing. And so again, you got to know. You'd have to ask to know. You won't know unless you ask this person and ask them what they're into. Meetup.com is a great resource. It's a pro-social place where people who have common interests meet. There's hikers club, bowling club, darts club, people who might want to go to a happy hour if the people in your life are into that. And it's just a great way to meet friends and perhaps meet a romantic partner as well. And that's a great pro-social site to be on, meetup.com. I suggest that if that's appropriate for the people that you work with. And then finally, there's the Register and Travel Action Group, and they have an extensive list of nations' policies towards allowing people to come visit their nation, from case studies and people who have tried to visit other nations. That's a good resource for travel. Prevention and support. So unfortunately, it's too late for a lot of the people who you work with, and they've entered the system, they've hurt people, and they've committed crimes. And unfortunately for the victims of these crimes, it's too damn late. But a lot of these people, most of them, all of them, are going home someday, right? They're not going to be under your care. They're not going to be in the system any longer. And so what do these people do when they're cut loose, when they no longer have a mandatory therapist, when they no longer have a PO, a supervisor? Well, there are resources. There are resources for people who are struggling with inappropriate attraction to minors, attraction to children. Help Wanted is a brand new effort that's launched out of the Johns Hopkins Center, and you'll find the web address there. They have a video series that talks about pedophilia, attraction to children, what you can do to prevent yourself from hurting someone, how you can manage these feelings. Prostasia Foundation has a similar goal in promoting awareness and prevention. The Virtuous Pedophiles are a group of men who have identified this as something that they have and something that they struggle with, and who have committed to a life offense-free. And so I think community is really important. And, you know, I've said it so many times, but this isn't going to apply to a lot of people on the registry. You know, not everyone is attracted to children, but for some that do, this could be a real game changer. Finally Talking for Change is based out of Canada, and they have a 24-hour line that you can call if you're struggling with inappropriate thoughts. And, you know, so many times treatment, for those of you who are treatment providers, it's tied to legal consequences, right? The person may be hesitant to say something to you because they know it's going to get back to the PO, or it's going to mean something for their supervision. So if contacting one of these organizations is what it takes for them to feel safe and not harm anyone, well, then I don't see anything wrong with that. But that will have to be your decision, right, for your caseload. Finally, we have our last column there. Fearless is a group that PARSOL runs once a month, and it's just a space for anyone who has been affected by the registry, that's family members, registrants, whoever wants to come and be in, can express themselves and find community. And then there's some 12-step groups for sexual compulsion, sexual addiction. SA is Sexaholics Anonymous. SAA is Sex Addicts Anonymous. And then SLAA is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And it's a 12-step group, and they specialize in sexual compulsion and addiction. And then finally, there's Smart Recovery for those who don't want to do a 12-step model. So that brings us just about to the end here. For our part, PARSOL is doing our best to promote prevention and to connect people with more prevention resources, and spread this message to our lawmakers. I have some references here for you, and I hope we have some time for some questions.
Yeah, and Randall, we have a few questions in the chat, hoping you can check that out. But one thing I also just wanted to add as a supplementary support that the coalition can offer, I'll put it in the chat. We recently launched our career services catalog for the coalition. It's on our website. It's accessible to all our members, and essentially it tries to get some more in-depth information on employment and education supports that the coalition offers. And one of the questions that we asked each organization that's on this catalog is whether they have any restrictions on who they're able to serve. So there's a good chunk of organizations in the coalition who offer employment and education supports without any restrictions on who they can serve based on any sort of like criminal legal offense. So if you as a support are unable to provide employment support, or are struggling to find job applications that are open to people with this particular background, I would highly encourage you to reach out to people on the coalition's page who may be able to support you. The coalition's all about, you know, relying on the strengths of each other's work and making referrals between programs when we're struggling. So I would also mention that as maybe a Philadelphia-based resource as well. One person who, and I'll now stop the recording. So thanks again, Randall, for presenting, and now we'll move on to the conversation portion.